My name is Nicolas, and at 67 years old, I never expected to be starting over. After my wife Margaret died, I spent months planning a special Sunday dinner to reconnect with my estranged daughter Jessica. I dedicated an entire weekend preparing all of her favorite childhood recipes, hoping food might bridge what words could not. When she arrived with her family, I thought we might finally heal old wounds. Instead, she looked me in the eyes and said words that shattered my world. "You're not family anymore. Get out." Before I continue this painful story, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever tried to rebuild broken family bonds, hit subscribe and like. Margaret and I were married for 40 years before cancer took her. We had the kind of marriage people envied, not perfect by any means, but solid, built on mutual respect and deep love that weathered every storm. She was my high school sweetheart, and we grew up together in every sense of the word. When we lost her 2 years ago, it was like losing half of myself. Our daughter Jessica was our only child. Margaret had complications during the birth that prevented us from having more children, so we poured all our love into Jessica. She was the center of our universe for many years, a bright, creative child with her mother's smile and, unfortunately, my stubborn streak. The problems between Jessica and me began when she went to college. I had my own carpentry business back then, building custom furniture and doing home renovations. Work consumed me. I was determined to give my family the financial security my own father never provided. My dad was a drinker who could never hold a steady job, and we often struggled to make ends meet. I swore my family would never know that kind of uncertainty. But my dedication to work came at a cost I didn't fully understand until it was too late. While I was physically providing for my family, I was emotionally absent in many ways. I missed dance recitals and school plays. I worked weekends when I should have been at soccer games. I convinced myself I was doing it all for them, but now I see I was also running from the deeper responsibilities of fatherhood. Margaret was our family's emotional center. She kept the peace, maintained traditions, and somehow translated between Jessica and me when we butted heads, which happened more frequently as Jessica entered her teenage years. Margaret would say, "You two are too alike to get along," and she was probably right. The breaking point came during Jessica's college graduation. I had taken on a major contract that could secure the business for years. When complications arose the day before her ceremony, I made a choice I've regretted every day since. I sent Margaret to the graduation alone while I stayed behind to handle the crisis with an important client. Jessica never forgave me for missing that milestone. After college, Jessica moved to Seattle for her first job. She would come home for holidays and occasional weekends, but our conversations were strained. Margaret always served as the buffer between us. When Jessica married Thomas 8 years ago, I struggled through my father of the bride speech, feeling like an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. 7 years ago, they gave us twins, a boy and girl named Samuel and Sophia, beautiful children that I barely know, despite living just 30 miles away. After the twins were born, Jessica's visits became even less frequent. She was building her own family unit, and I seemed to exist on the periphery. Margaret visited them often, sometimes without me, maintaining the grandmother connection while the grandfather-grandchildren relationship withered before it had a chance to grow. When Margaret got sick, everything changed. The cancer moved quickly, giving us just 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Jessica visited a few times during Margaret's illness, but the visits were tense. We never discussed our fractured relationship because all focus was rightfully on Margaret. In her final weeks, Margaret made me promise to repair things with Jessica, a deathbed request I took seriously, even as I had no idea how to fulfill it. After Margaret passed, Jessica barely attended the funeral. She arrived late, left immediately after the service, and avoided the gathering at our house. In the 2 years since, our contact had dwindled to occasional text messages and brief phone calls on birthdays and holidays. I sent gifts to the twins that were acknowledged with formal thank you cards that felt like they were written under duress. Retirement without Margaret was a lonely existence. The business I had sacrificed so much to build was sold to my longtime employee. The house that once buzzed with life felt cavernous and empty. I filled my days with small projects and television, but the silence was deafening. Without Margaret as our connection, Jessica and I drifted further apart, like continents, slowly but inexorably separating across an expanding ocean. Then last month, something unexpected happened. My brother Frank passed away suddenly from a heart attack. We had never been particularly close, but he had no children of his own, and he left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to make me stop and think about what truly mattered. As I sat in my silent house, staring at the check, I made a decision. This unexpected windfall would be my opportunity to rebuild what I had lost. I would use it not on things, but on creating a chance for reconciliation. First, I renovated my dining room, the place where our family had once shared countless meals together. I replaced the old table where Jessica had done her homework, where we had celebrated birthdays and Thanksgivings, with a beautiful new hardwood table I crafted myself. I repainted the walls in warm colors that Margaret would have approved of, and hung family photos that had been packed away after her death. Then, heart pounding like a teenager asking for a first date, I called Jessica. The conversation was awkward, filled with uncomfortable pauses and superficial pleasantries. But when I extended the invitation for Sunday dinner, suggesting she bring Thomas and the twins, I was shocked when, after a long pause, she agreed. Her voice carried no enthusiasm, but she said yes, and that was enough to kindle hope in my heart. Once Jessica agreed to dinner, I threw myself into preparations with an intensity that surprised even me. The house had fallen into a state of neglect since Margaret died. I had maintained the bare minimum of cleanliness, but dust had gathered in corners, windows were smudged, and the yard looked untamed. For a full week, I cleaned every surface, washed every window, and manicured the lawn and garden to the standards Margaret had once maintained. In the back of the hall closet, I found Margaret's recipe box, a simple wooden container I had made for her during our first year of marriage. Opening it felt like opening a time capsule. Each card was written in her neat, flowing handwriting, many splattered with sauce stains and butter marks from years of use. As I flipped through them, memories flooded back. Her famous pot roast that Jessica requested every birthday until she was 16. The apple pie that won blue ribbons at 3 county fairs. The special macaroni and cheese that could coax a smile from Jessica even during her moodiest teenage phases. I selected recipes that held special significance for our family, planning a meal that would speak of love and history in ways my inadequate words could not. The shopping expedition took me to 4 different stores. I splurged on premium ingredients, despite my fixed retirement income. Prime beef for the pot roast, organic vegetables for the sides, and the expensive vanilla extract Margaret always insisted made all the difference in her baking. Back at home, I realized I was out of practice. Margaret had done most of the cooking during our marriage, and since her death, I had subsisted mainly on frozen dinners and sandwiches. I spent several days practicing, making test versions of the more complicated dishes. My first attempt at Margaret's apple pie was a disaster, the crust tough and the filling too runny. By the 4th attempt, it was almost up to her standards. In my workshop, I carved small wooden toys for Samuel and Sophia, a little car for him and a butterfly for her, simple toys designed for small hands. I had no idea what they liked. Did Samuel prefer dinosaurs to cars? Was Sophia too old for butterflies now? The gaps in my knowledge about my own grandchildren were painful reminders of all I had missed. Desperate for guidance, I reached out to Amanda, Jessica's best friend from childhood, who still lived in the area. We met for coffee, and I peppered her with questions about how to connect with Jessica, what topics to avoid, what might build bridges instead of walls. Amanda was kind but honest. "Jessica has trust issues with you, Mr. Bennett," she said. "She feels like she spent her whole childhood trying to get your attention. Now she protects herself by keeping you at arm's length." Her words stung but rang true. Amanda suggested I focus on listening rather than talking, on asking questions about Jessica's life rather than defending my past actions. "And whatever you do," she added as we parted, "don't try to buy her forgiveness with money or gifts. She needs to know you value her, not what you can give her." The night before the dinner, I set the table with Margaret's best dishes, the ones we used only for special occasions. I placed her favorite tablecloth, freshly ironed, on the new table. I arranged family photos around the room, including several of Jessica growing up that I hoped might spark positive memories. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing conversations, trying to anticipate difficult moments and prepare responses that wouldn't escalate tension. "I was wrong to miss your graduation," I practiced saying. "There's no excuse good enough, and I'm sorry. And, tell me about your job, Jessica. I want to know what you do day to day." I barely slept that night, my mind cycling through scenarios both wonderful and terrible. In the best versions, Jessica melted at the sight of the renovated dining room and the meal I had prepared. Conversation flowed easily, barriers dropped, and by dessert we were planning regular family dinners. In the worst versions, she refused to enter the house at all, or storms out after the first awkward exchange. Reality, I knew, would likely fall somewhere in between. I woke at 5 in the morning, too anxious to sleep. By 6, I was in the kitchen beginning preparations. The pot roast needed hours to cook to perfection. The pie crust needed to chill. Vegetables needed to be chopped. As I worked, muscle memory took over, and I found myself using Margaret's techniques, even mimicking some of her movements. For brief moments, it felt like she was there with me, guiding my hands. As I worked, memories surfaced of happier times. Jessica at 10, standing on a step stool beside Margaret at the stove, learning to make her first cake. Jessica at 16, rolling her eyes but secretly pleased when I complimented her new haircut at the dinner table. The three of us laughing until tears came over some long-forgotten joke during a summer barbecue. Those memories fueled my hope. Despite everything, we had been happy once. We had been a family. If those connections existed once, surely they could be rebuilt. As the house filled with the familiar smells of Margaret's recipes, I allowed myself to visualize a new future. Regular Sunday dinners with Jessica, Thomas, and the twins. Christmases and Thanksgivings around this very table. Perhaps even weekends where the twins might stay with their grandfather, learning carpentry in my workshop as Jessica once had. By 1 o'clock, everything was ready. The table was set, the food was prepared, and I had changed into my best sweater, the green one Margaret always said brought out the color of my eyes. All that remained was to wait for my family to arrive, and to hope that food and good intentions would be enough to begin healing decades of hurt. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My heart jumped into my throat as I smoothed my sweater one last time and went to answer it. There they stood on my porch, looking like a perfect family from a magazine advertisement. Jessica, her blonde hair now cut in a sophisticated bob, wearing a blue dress that emphasized her professional poise. Thomas beside her, tall and solid, in a button-down shirt and slacks, his hand protectively on Jessica's lower back. And in front of them, the twins, 7 years old and absolutely beautiful. "Hello," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Thank you for coming." Jessica nodded stiffly. "Thanks for the invitation." The awkwardness was palpable as they entered the house. The twins, Samuel and Sophia, hid partially behind their parents, peering at me with open curiosity but no recognition. It struck me painfully that to them, I was essentially a stranger. "Hi there," I said, kneeling down to their level despite my creaky knees. "I'm your grandpa Nicolas. I'm really happy you could come visit today." Samuel tucked his head against his father's leg. Sophia gave a tiny wave before ducking behind her mother. "They're a little shy with people they don't know well," Thomas explained, filling the uncomfortable silence. He at least made eye contact with me, offering a small smile that seemed genuine if cautious. "Of course," I said, standing up with some effort. "Would you like a tour of the house?" "I've made some changes since you were last here, Jessica." Jessica looked around the entryway, her expression unreadable. "Sure," she said, though her tone suggested she was merely being polite. I led them through the living room, where new curtains hung, and Margaret's collection of bird figurines had been carefully arranged on shelves. As we entered the kitchen, Jessica frowned. "You painted over Mom's yellow walls," she observed, her voice carrying an accusation. "Yes," I admitted. The yellow was fading badly, and I thought this cream color brightened things up while still feeling warm. "Mom loved those yellow walls," Jessica said, running her fingers along the counter. She said they reminded her of sunshine even on rainy days. Before I could respond, Thomas jumped in. "The new color looks great. Very modern but still classic." I shot him a grateful look. "Thank you." The kitchen needed updating, but I tried to keep its character. When we reached the dining room, I held my breath. This was the space I had put the most work into, hoping it would communicate my intentions better than words could. "This table is new," Jessica commented, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "I made it," I said, unable to keep a note of pride from my voice. "Solid oak. I thought we needed a good family table for gatherings like this." Jessica's expression flickered between something like appreciation and suspicion, as if trying to decide whether this was a genuine gesture or manipulation. Before she could respond, I remembered the gifts. "I have something for the little ones," I said, retrieving the wooden toys from the sideboard drawer. "Nothing fancy, just something I carved in my workshop." I held out the car and butterfly. Samuel peeked out from behind Thomas's leg. His interest obviously piqued. "What do we say?" Thomas prompted gently. "Thank you," Samuel whispered, reaching for the car. Sophia took longer to convince, but curiosity eventually won out. She accepted the butterfly, turning it over in her small hands, examining the detailed wings I had spent hours carving and sanding. "It's pretty," she said softly, and my heart swelled. "Would you like to see how the wings move?" I asked, showing her the simple mechanism that made the butterfly's wings gently flap. Her eyes widened in delight, and for a moment, the tension in the room eased. The twins gradually became more comfortable, examining their toys and even asking questions about how they were made. "Grandpa is a carpenter," Thomas explained to them. "He makes things from wood." "Like a workshop elf?" Samuel asked, and everyone laughed, breaking the ice further. "Something like that," I agreed, though not quite as magical as an elf. "Did you build houses too?" Thomas asked, seeming genuinely interested in my work. "Mostly furniture and renovations," I explained, warming to the subject. "Custom pieces for people who wanted something unique. Each piece tells a story, in a way." As I spoke about my work, Thomas asked thoughtful questions that showed real interest. He had a background in engineering, and we found common ground discussing design principles and material properties. Meanwhile, Jessica checked her phone repeatedly, her body language communicating clear discomfort. She contributed little to the conversation, offering only brief responses when directly addressed. When Samuel asked her a question, she snapped at him more sharply than the situation warranted, then immediately looked guilty. I guided everyone to the living room, where I had set out appetizers on the coffee table. Margaret's famous spinach dip with homemade bread, cheese straws that Jessica had loved as a child, and a fruit platter arranged the way Margaret always did it. "These are just to tide us over," I explained. "The main meal will be ready in about an hour." Thomas immediately complimented the bread, taking seconds and encouraging the twins to try everything. Jessica, however, barely touched the food, picking at a cheese straw without actually eating it. When I mentioned that the spinach dip was Margaret's recipe, a shadow crossed Jessica's face. "Mom made it differently," she said. "This has too much garlic." "I followed her recipe card exactly," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Well, she must have changed it later," Jessica insisted. "This isn't how I remember it." Thomas quickly changed the subject, asking about family photos displayed on the mantel. As I explained when and where they were taken, I noticed Jessica's eyes grow shiny with unshed tears when we reached a photo of her high school graduation, with Margaret beaming proudly beside her. The conversation stuttered and stalled despite Thomas's valiant efforts. When the twins wandered over to examine the television, Jessica and Thomas stepped into the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear them. "You promised you'd try," Thomas whispered urgently. "I am trying," Jessica hissed back. "But this whole thing feels like a manipulation. The photos, Mom's recipes, the table he supposedly built for family gatherings, when we haven't been a family in years. He's making an effort," Thomas countered. "That's what you said you wanted. Not like this. Not with all these emotional props." Their whispered argument ended abruptly when they realized Samuel had followed them and was listening wide-eyed. They returned to the living room, Jessica's smile now fixed and brittle. I pretended I hadn't overheard, suggesting we move to the dining room for the main course. As I served the pot roast, vegetables, and homemade rolls, I searched for neutral topics of conversation. "How's work going for both of you?" I asked. Thomas launched into an explanation of his current project, something to do with sustainable building materials that aligned with my own interests in woodworking. Jessica mentioned her marketing firm briefly, but offered few details about her role as a senior manager. Throughout the meal, the twins provided welcome distractions from the adult tension. Sophia told a long, complicated story about her best friend's birthday party, while Samuel asked if I had tools in my workshop that could help him build a fort in their backyard. "I'd be happy to help with that," I offered, glancing at Jessica for approval. Her face tightened. "We'll see. Thomas is pretty handy himself." It wasn't a no, but it wasn't an invitation either. As the meal progressed, I could feel the precarious balance of the evening tilting toward conflict, despite my best intentions and Thomas's peacekeeping efforts. As we finished the main course, I decided to broach a subject I had carefully planned. "I've been thinking about the twins' future," I said, refilling Thomas's water glass. "Now that I'm retired and have this small inheritance from my brother, I'd like to set up education accounts for Samuel and Sophia." The words had barely left my mouth when Jessica's posture stiffened. "That's not necessary," she said sharply. "It's no burden," I assured her. "I've worked out the numbers, and I can contribute a modest amount each month. By the time they're ready for college, it would make a real difference." Jessica's fork clattered against her plate. "So now you care about education? Where was this generosity when I was struggling with student loans?" Thomas placed a warning hand on Jessica's arm. "Jess, this isn't the time." She shook him off. "No, I want to know. Why are you suddenly interested in being the generous grandfather when you couldn't even be bothered to be present as a father?" The twins looked up, sensing the change in atmosphere. Sophia's lower lip trembled slightly. "I made mistakes," I acknowledged, setting down my own fork. Many of them. I was focused on providing financially, on building security, and I missed what was equally important. "Equally?" Jessica laughed without humor. "Try primarily. Do you know what it was like growing up with a father who was physically present but emotionally absent? Who measured love in dollar signs and working hours?" "That's not fair," I said, feeling defensive despite my resolve to remain calm. I was doing what I thought was right. My own father drank away his paychecks. We went without basic necessities. I swore that wouldn't happen to my family. So instead, we went without a father. Jessica shot back. "Great trade-off." Thomas intervened again. "Maybe we should focus on the future, not the past. Nicolas is trying to connect with his grandchildren now, and that's what matters." Jessica turned her glare to Thomas. "Easy for you to say. He wasn't your father who missed every important moment of your childhood." I tried another approach. "Jessica, there's something I never told you about your mother's final days. Something I think you should know." "Don't?" she warned, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare use Mom's memory to manipulate me." "It's not manipulation," I protested. "It's the truth. She wanted us to reconcile. Her last words to me were about you, about us fixing what was broken. If she wanted that, it was because you fed her some line about changing," Jessica said. "But people don't change, not really, not at their core." The twins were now openly uncomfortable, with Samuel whispering something to Thomas, who nodded reassuringly. "Why did you come today?" I asked. The question that had been burning inside me. If you believe people don't change, why accept my invitation? Jessica looked at Thomas, then back at me. Because Thomas thought it was important. He said I should give you one more chance. The word stung more than I expected, not because she had come at her husband's insistence, but because she had framed it as one more chance, as if there had been many before. In reality, this was the first real attempt at reconciliation since Margaret died. "I see," I said quietly. "And have I failed this test already?" "This isn't a test," Jessica snapped. "This is me trying to figure out if there's anything left to salvage, or if we're just going through motions for Thomas's sense of family obligation." "It's not obligation," Thomas interjected. "It's about the kids having a relationship with their grandfather, about healing old wounds." "Some wounds don't heal," Jessica said. "Some just get covered with scar tissue that hurts every time you touch it." "Like your college graduation," I said, naming the elephant that had been in our relationship for decades. Jessica's eyes flashed. "Yes, like that. Do you know what it felt like, scanning the audience for your face, knowing you had chosen work over one of the most important days of my life? I made a terrible choice," I admitted. "If I could go back and change it, I would. But I can't. All I can do is apologize and try to do better now." "An apology 20 years late doesn't mean much," Jessica said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. The twins were now visibly distressed. Sophia had tears in her eyes, and Samuel was hunched in his chair, making himself as small as possible. "Maybe we should take a break," Thomas suggested. "The kids are getting upset." "You're right," Jessica agreed, her eyes softening as she looked at her children. "Samuel, Sophia, why don't you go look at the backyard? Remember we saw that swing set from the driveway?" After Thomas made sure the backyard gate was secure, he let the twins outside to play, giving the adults space to continue their conversation without young ears listening. Once the children were out of earshot, Jessica turned back to me. "This dinner was a mistake," she said, but her voice now held more sadness than anger. "We can't fix decades of issues over pot roast, no matter how good the recipe is." "Maybe not," I conceded, "but we have to start somewhere." After the twins went outside under Thomas's supervision, I brought out dessert, Margaret's famous apple pie with homemade vanilla ice cream. I set it down in the center of the table, with a flourish that felt hollow given the tension still thick in the air. "Your mother won blue ribbons for this pie 3 years running at the county fair," I said, cutting a generous slice for Jessica. She looked at the pie but made no move to take her plate. "I remember," she said flatly. "Would you like some?" I asked, the plate suspended between us. "No," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm not hungry." I set the plate down, feeling the rejection as if she had slapped me. "Jessica, I spent days practicing to get this recipe right. Your mother's exact recipe." "That's the problem," Jessica said. "This whole dinner, this whole performance. You're using Mom's recipes, Mom's dishes, Mom's memory, as emotional manipulation." "That's not true," I protested. "I'm trying to honor her memory, to create connection through the things she valued." "Mom valued authenticity," Jessica shot back. "Not this staged family reunion designed to make you feel better about your failings as a father." The conversation paused as Thomas returned with the twins, who were pink-cheeked from running around the yard. They dove into their pie slices with enthusiasm that highlighted the adult tension by contrast. After a few moments of watching the children eat, I tried again. "Do you remember the summer we went camping in the Cascades?" I asked, reaching for a positive memory. "You were 12, and you insisted on helping me set up the tent, even though the instructions were missing." "I remember Mom spent half the trip with Poison Oak because you set up camp right next to it despite her warnings," Jessica replied. "That wasn't how it happened," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "We didn't know it was Poison Oak until later, and as I recall, you were the one who picked the campsite. It was the wrong thing to say." Jessica's face flushed red. "Typical," she snapped. "Blame the child for the adult's mistakes. Just like when I spilled juice on your precious blueprints, and you yelled so loudly, 'Mrs. Henderson next door called to make sure everything was okay.'" The memory hit me hard. I had forgotten that incident, but now it came rushing back. Jessica at 7, trying to bring me a glass of juice while I worked late at the dining table. The glass slipping from her small hands, drenching plans for an important client. My explosive reaction, born of stress and sleep deprivation, terrifying her into tears. "I was wrong to yell at you," I said quietly. "You were trying to be helpful, and I overreacted." "That was the story of my childhood," Jessica said, pushing back from the table, "trying to get your attention, your approval, and being either ignored or reprimanded for my efforts. This was a mistake. We should go." "Jessica, please," I said, desperation edging my voice. "We've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to say, to understand about each other." "I understand everything I need to," she said, standing up. "Thomas, get the kids' jackets." Thomas hesitated, looking between us with clear conflict on his face. "Jess, maybe we should stay. Talk this through." "There's nothing to talk through," Jessica insisted. "This is the same pattern it's always been. He wants instant forgiveness without doing the real work of understanding the hurt he caused." "That's not true," I said, my own anger finally rising. "I've spent years reflecting on my mistakes. I know what I did wrong. I was emotionally unavailable. I prioritized work over family time. I missed important events. But I did it because I thought providing financially was my primary responsibility as a father." "A convenient excuse," Jessica said, reaching for her purse. "It's not an excuse, it's an explanation," I countered. "And if we're tallying failures, your refusal to even try to understand my perspective isn't exactly the high ground." Jessica froze, then turned to me with cold fury. "How dare you?" she said quietly. "How dare you suggest equivalence between your decades of emotional neglect and my protective distance?" "Mom wouldn't want this," I said, immediately regretting invoking Margaret again. Jessica's face contorted. "Don't tell me what Mom would want," she nearly shouted. "You barely knew her. You were so busy with your precious business that her own husband was a stranger to her half the time." That cut deep, striking at insecurities I had harbored since Margaret's death. "I was married to your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "We built a life together through good times and hard times. Don't presume to tell me I didn't know my own wife. You knew the version of her that accommodated your absence," Jessica said. "The version that made excuses for you to me, that carried the entire emotional burden of our family." Thomas had gathered the twins, who now stood wide-eyed in the doorway, clearly frightened by the raised voices. "Jessica," Thomas said firmly. "The kids." She looked at her children and visibly tried to compose herself. "We're leaving," she said with forced calm. "Say goodbye to your grandfather." In desperation, I played my last card. "I've updated my will," I said. "I want to make sure the twins are provided for, and that you have some security as well." It was exactly the wrong approach. Jessica's face transformed from anger to disgust. "You still don't get it," she said. "You still think money is the answer to everything. That you can buy your way into our lives after being emotionally absent for decades." "That's not what I meant," I protested. "You're not family anymore," Jessica exploded, the words echoing in the suddenly silent room. "Get out." We all stood frozen for a moment, the absurdity of her telling me to get out of my own house hanging in the air. "This is my house," I finally said quietly. "Fine," Jessica said, grabbing her coat. "Then we'll get out. Come on, kids." Thomas. As they gathered their belongings in a flurry of movement, I felt something break inside me, a dam of patience and hope finally giving way to my own pain and anger. "Remember this date well, Jessica," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Today you didn't just lose your father, you destroyed your future." Jessica paused at the door, her back to me, shoulders rigid. For a moment, I thought she might turn around, might say something to bridge the chasm that had just widened between us. Instead, she ushered her family out the door without another word, leaving me alone in a house filled with the remnants of a meal meant to heal, but that had instead deepened our wounds. I sat back down at the dining table, surrounded by half-eaten food and empty chairs. The silence was absolute and devastating. All my planning, all my hope, had led to this moment of complete failure. As the sun began to set outside the dining room windows, I remained motionless, unable to process what had just happened or what might come next. That night, sleep was impossible. I paced the house until dawn, replaying every moment of the disastrous dinner, analyzing what I could have said differently, done differently, to prevent the catastrophic ending. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but rest still wouldn't come. For 3 days, I couldn't bring myself to clean up the dining room. The congealed food, the dirty dishes, the abandoned dessert all remained exactly as they had been left, a monument to failure. Finally, on the 4th day, I forced myself to tackle the mess, throwing out food that had been prepared with such hope and care. I couldn't stomach eating any of it. Each bite would have tasted of disappointment and regret. As I washed Margaret's good dishes, I found myself talking to her as if she were standing beside me. "I tried, Maggie," I said to the empty kitchen. "I really tried, but I made it worse, just like I always do with her." I could almost hear Margaret's gentle response, encouraging patience, reminding me that healing takes time. But time was something I wasn't sure Jessica and I had anymore. Her final declaration still rang in my ears. "You're not family anymore." Had there ever been words more painful to hear from one's child? After a week of isolation and self-recrimination, I realized I was falling into old patterns, withdrawing rather than reaching out. I called my old friend Robert, whom I hadn't spoken to in months, and accepted his standing invitation for golf. It was awkward at first, my social skills rusty from disuse, but by the 9th hole, some of the heaviness had lifted from my chest. Encouraged by this small success, I contacted other friends, former colleagues, neighbors I had been avoiding. I joined a weekly card game at the community center, forcing myself out of the empty house that had become both sanctuary and prison. Each small interaction rebuilt a bit of my confidence, reminding me that I still had value beyond my failed role as father and grandfather. During one particularly low evening, I found myself driving past the office of a therapist whose card Margaret's hospice nurse had given me. I had stuffed it in my wallet and forgotten it until a recent cleaning spree. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and wrote down the phone number. The next day, I made an appointment. Dr. Peterson was a woman about Jessica's age, with kind eyes and a direct manner that reminded me somewhat of Margaret. In our first session, I unloaded the whole story of Jessica, the dinner disaster, and decades of misunderstanding and hurt. "You keep focusing on what you did wrong," Dr. Peterson observed after listening patiently. "And there were mistakes, certainly. But have you considered that Jessica's perspective might be distorted by her own fears and insecurities?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "Children often internalize their parents' absence as a reflection on themselves," she explained. "Jessica may have interpreted your focus on work, not as providing security, but as evidence that she wasn't important enough to prioritize." This perspective hit me like a physical blow. Had Jessica spent her life believing she wasn't worthy of my time and attention? The thought was unbearable, yet it explained so much about her anger and distance. Over several sessions, Dr. Peterson helped me understand Jessica's perspective better, without minimizing my own pain and regret. She encouraged me to write down my thoughts in a letter to Jessica, regardless of whether I ever sent it. The exercise was cathartic, allowing me to articulate both my remorse for past failures and my hopes for future healing, without defense or justification. As April turned to May, I threw myself into volunteer work at a local youth center, teaching basic carpentry skills to disadvantaged teenagers. Working with these young people, many of whom had no consistent father figures in their lives, gave me purpose while helping me understand the lasting impact of parental presence or absence. One evening, 3 weeks after the dinner disaster, my phone rang with Thomas's number. My hand trembled as I answered. "Nicolas," Thomas said, his voice hesitant. "I wanted to call and apologize for how everything ended at dinner." "You have nothing to apologize for," I assured him. "You were trying to help." "Still, "It was difficult for everyone," he said. "The kids have been asking about you. They liked their wooden toys." My heart lifted slightly. "They did? Samuel sleeps with that car," Thomas said, a smile in his voice. "And Sophia put the butterfly on her bookshelf in a place of honor." We talked for nearly an hour. Thomas explained that he had grown up without a father, lost to cancer when Thomas was just 4. He had always valued family connections and hated to see the rift between Jessica and me. "There's something you should know about Jessica," Thomas said eventually. "Something that might help explain her reaction at dinner." He told me about Jessica's struggles with perfectionism, her fear of abandonment that manifested as preemptive rejection, pushing people away before they could leave her. He mentioned work pressures that had been mounting for months, with Jessica facing a potential demotion despite years of dedication to her company. "She won't talk about it, but I know it's eating at her," Thomas confided. "She's terrified of failure, always has been. I think she sees it as confirming some deep belief that she's not good enough, not worthy of success or love." "Not worthy?" I repeated, Dr. Peterson's words echoing in my mind. "She's always been worthy, always been loved." "I know that," Thomas said gently, "but I'm not sure she does." After we hung up, I sat in my armchair until well past midnight, turning this new information over in my mind. The Jessica that Thomas described was different from the confident, angry woman who had sat at my dinner table. She was vulnerable, insecure, afraid in ways I had never recognized. I wondered how much of her adult personality had been shaped by the little girl who could never seem to get her busy father's attention. The next day, I called Dr. Peterson for an emergency session. "I need to understand how to help someone who doesn't believe they're worthy of love," I told her. "And I need to understand what part I played in creating that belief." As May turned to June, I continued building my own life, accepting that reconciliation couldn't be forced or rushed. I joined a grief support group for widowers, where I found men facing similar struggles with loneliness and redefined purpose. I expanded my volunteer work, and even started dating, very casually, a woman from my community center art class. I put my house on the market, finally accepting that it contained too many ghosts and that downsizing made financial sense. I researched retirement communities that offered woodworking shops and social activities, places where I might build a new chapter rather than haunting the empty rooms of the old one. Throughout these changes, I held on to hope that someday, somehow, Jessica and I might find our way back to each other. But I also accepted that it might not happen, that some breaks resist even the most careful repair attempts. Either way, I was determined to live a life Margaret would be proud of, and to be ready for reconnection if the opportunity ever came. On a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after our disastrous dinner, my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately, my heart pounding. "Dad?" Her voice broke on the single syllable, and I could hear that she was crying. "Jessica," I said, almost afraid to breathe. "What's wrong?" "Everything," she sobbed. "Everything's wrong. I lost my job yesterday. They restructured the entire marketing department and eliminated my position." "I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely distressed for her. "Are you okay?" "No," she admitted through tears. "I've been with the company for 12 years. I worked nights and weekends. I missed school events with the twins, and they just replaced me with someone younger and cheaper." The parallels to my own workaholism weren't lost on me, but this wasn't the time to point them out. "That's terrible, Jessica. Truly unfair. Thomas is being supportive," she continued, her voice steadying slightly. "He says we'll be fine financially for a while. But it's not just the money. This job was my identity. It was how I proved I was valuable." "You're valuable without a job title," I said gently. "You're valuable simply because you exist." There was a long pause. "That's what Thomas keeps saying," she finally responded. "But it doesn't feel true. I feel like a failure." "You're not a failure," I assured her. "You're experiencing a setback, that's all. A painful one, certainly, but not a reflection of your worth." We talked for nearly an hour. Jessica's defenses were down, stripped away by the shock of job loss and the vulnerability of unexpected change. She admitted that her outburst at dinner had been partially fueled by mounting work stress she hadn't disclosed, knowing even then that layoffs were coming. "I was terrified and taking it out on you," she said. "That doesn't excuse everything I said, but it explains some of it. Would you like to meet for coffee?" I suggested cautiously. Just the two of us. Neutral territory. After a brief hesitation, she agreed. We set a time for the following afternoon at a small cafe halfway between our homes. I arrived early, securing a quiet table in the corner. When Jessica walked in, I barely recognized her. Gone was the polished professional from dinner. This Jessica looked exhausted, her hair pulled back carelessly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she sat down. "Thank you for calling," I replied. "It was brave of you." She gave a small, humorless laugh. Not brave, desperate. I didn't know who else to call who would understand career disappointment without offering empty platitudes. We ordered coffee, and for several minutes, we talked about her job loss, the unfairness of corporate politics, the anxiety of starting over in a competitive field. I mostly listened, offering support without advice, remembering Amanda's suggestion weeks earlier. Gradually, the conversation shifted to deeper waters. "I've been seeing a therapist," I admitted, trying to understand where things went wrong between us. Jessica looked surprised. "You have?" I nodded. "I've learned some things about myself that aren't particularly flattering. About how my own father's failures shaped my determination to succeed financially, often at the expense of emotional connection." "I've been in therapy too," Jessica confessed. "Since before the twins were born, I have. Abandonment issues, apparently. I wonder where those came from," I said sadly. "It's not all your fault," Jessica said, surprising me. "Mom enabled it by always making excuses for you, and I developed some unhealthy coping mechanisms very early. Perfectionism, achievement as proof of worth. Sound familiar?" I nodded, seeing myself reflected in her description. "When I lost my job," Jessica continued, "my first thought wasn't about money or career. It was, now Dad will see I'm a failure too. Isn't that strange? After all these years, I'm still that little girl trying to earn your approval." The confession broke something open between us. For the next hour, we talked with more honesty than we had in decades, perhaps ever. I shared my memories of her childhood, the pride I had felt but rarely expressed adequately. She described how she had interpreted my absences as evidence of her inadequacy rather than my own flawed priorities. "I never felt I was enough," she admitted. "Good grades, perfect behavior, achievements. Nothing seemed to pull you away from work. So eventually I stopped trying." "You were always enough," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "The failure was mine, not yours. I didn't know how to show love except through financial provision." "My therapist says that's common for men of your generation," Jessica said, not pulling her hand away. "Especially those with difficult fathers themselves." As our coffee grew cold, we began tentatively discussing practical steps forward. Jessica mentioned that with her job loss, childcare had become an issue. Thomas worked full-time, and summer vacation meant the twins would be home all day. "I could help," I offered cautiously. "I'm retired, with flexible time. I could watch them some afternoons while you job hunt or just need a break." Jessica hesitated, old fears visibly battling with practical needs. "You'd do that?" "I'd love to," I said sincerely. "It would give me a chance to get to know them, and to be the kind of grandfather I never had myself." 2 days later, I welcomed Samuel and Sophia to my house for the first time since the dinner disaster. They were shy initially, but curiosity soon overcame caution. Samuel asked about my workshop, and by afternoon's end, we had started a simple birdhouse project together. Sophia discovered Margaret's old piano in the living room and asked if she could play. That first afternoon led to regular Tuesday and Thursday visits. Jessica would drop the twins off after lunch and pick them up before dinner, using the hours in between for job interviews or simply self-care time. At first, our interactions were strictly practical, limited to handoff information about the children's needs or schedules. But gradually, small conversations developed. Brief updates expanded into genuine exchanges. By July, Jessica had found a new position with a smaller company that offered better work-life balance, though less prestige and slightly lower pay. "I'm actually home for dinner every night," she told me during one pickup. The twins can't believe it. In August, she surprised me by asking if the twins could stay overnight so she and Thomas could celebrate their anniversary. It was a small vote of confidence that meant the world to me. When fall approached, Jessica called with another proposition. "School starts next week, but there's a 2-hour gap between dismissal and when either Thomas or I can pick them up," she explained. "Would you be interested in doing after-school care a few days a week? We'd pay you, of course." "I'd be honored," I said, "but no payment necessary. Time with them is payment enough." And so began a new routine. 3 afternoons a week I would pick up Samuel and Sophia from elementary school. We would return to my house, where homework was completed before fun activities began. Samuel developed a genuine interest in woodworking, while Sophia gravitated toward baking, using Margaret's recipes that I had carefully preserved. By November, Jessica extended a tentative invitation to Thanksgiving dinner at their house. "It won't be anything fancy," she warned, "and my cooking isn't as good as Mom's was." "I'd love to come," I said simply. The Thanksgiving gathering was still awkward in many ways. Conversation sometimes stalled, and old tensions occasionally surfaced. But we were trying, all of us, to build something new from the ruins of what had been broken. December brought another milestone. Jessica called to say, "The kids want you at their holiday concert. Samuel has a speaking part, and Sophia is singing a solo." I sat in the auditorium with Jessica and Thomas, bursting with pride as my grandchildren performed, and fighting tears when Samuel spotted me in the audience and gave an enthusiastic wave mid-performance. After the concert, Jessica said casually, "We're having a small Christmas Eve gathering. Nothing elaborate, but we'd like you to join us, if you want." By Christmas, our relationship had developed a new rhythm. Not the easy closeness that might have been if decades of distance hadn't separated us, but something honest and gradually strengthening. We had begun to see each other not as the roles we occupied or the hurts we had caused, but as complex, flawed humans doing our imperfect best. In February, I finalized the sale of my house. But instead of the retirement community I had researched, I purchased a small ranch-style home just 10 minutes from Jessica's family. The new place had a dedicated workshop where Samuel was a frequent visitor, and a kitchen where Sophia continued to master Margaret's recipes. One Saturday in early spring, as we worked together building a more elaborate birdhouse, I glanced around my workshop to see 3 generations focused on the project. Jessica was sanding a piece of wood with careful concentration. Thomas was measuring and marking the next cuts. Samuel was sorting screws with great seriousness, while Sophia sketched decorative elements to be added later. The scene wasn't perfect. We still had moments of tension and misunderstanding. Jessica and I sometimes retreated to old patterns when stressed. The twins occasionally tested boundaries in ways that highlighted our different parenting philosophies. But we were learning, all of us, how to be a family despite our broken places, perhaps even because of them. That evening, after Jessica and her family had gone home, I sat on my new porch watching the sunset. I thought about the journey of the past year, from that disastrous dinner to this gradually healing present. I had learned that forgiveness isn't a single moment, but a daily choice. That relationships aren't restored through grand gestures, but through consistent small actions that rebuild trust one interaction at a time. The family table I had tried so hard to restore didn't need an elaborate meal or perfect conversation. It needed patience, honesty, and the willingness to listen more than speak. It needed the humility to acknowledge harm without defensiveness, and the courage to try again after failure. Looking back, I could see how losing everything had opened the door to what truly mattered. How Jessica's job loss had created vulnerability that allowed for new connection. How my own lonely grief had finally pushed me toward change I had resisted for decades. The path forward wouldn't always be smooth. Jessica and I carried too much history for perfect resolution, but we had found a way to honor Margaret's memory, not through recipes or rituals, but through the hard work of reconciliation she had always valued most. What has your experience been with family reconciliation? Has a crisis ever opened unexpected doors to healing in your relationships? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more reflections on family, forgiveness, and second chances. And consider sharing this with someone who might be waiting for the courage to make that first call, send that first text, or extend that first invitation toward healing a broken relationship. Thank you for listening, and remember that, while we can't change the past, today's choices create tomorrow's possibilities.